Welcome to the debate. When a structural engineer looks at a collapsed bridge, they're faced with a fundamental question of causality.
Right. Why did the thing actually fall down?
Exactly. Did the bridge fall because decades of rust and neglected maintenance fundamentally weakened the steel, or did it fall because a freight truck vastly exceeding the weight limit suddenly drove across it?
Oh, I see where you're going. The rust is the environment.
Yep, the rust is the environment and the truck is the shock.
And, in structural engineering, just like in public health, diagnosing the exact mechanism of failure isn't just an academic exercise. It dictates exactly how you rebuild.
Absolutely.
Because if you just patch over the rust without banning the heavy trucks, the bridge falls again. But if you ban the trucks and completely ignore the rotting steel, well, a stiff wind might eventually bring the whole thing down anyway.
Precisely. And that brings us to the central question we are exploring today. Are surging addiction rates and drug-related mortality primarily a symptom of environmental collapse and social despair? Or are they fundamentally driven by biological vulnerability and lethal supply-side market shocks?
Which is such a massive question.
It really is. And when you actually layer the medical data over the economic data, a really fascinating tension emerges. We're going to dive into everything from the famous 1970s rat park experiments to Anne Case and Angus Deaton's research on deaths of despair.
We'll also be looking at Christopher Room's economic critiques of that exact theory and recent data on how the COVID-19 pandemic acted as a massive stress test for substance use.
It is a critical distinction to make.
It really is.
So I will be arguing that addiction is fundamentally an environmental adaptation. It is a predictable, almost entirely human response to isolation, economic stagnation, and a profound sense of social despair.
And I will be arguing that the recent crisis we are seeing is primarily a biological vulnerability being exploited by an unprecedented, highly lethal supply-side shock of potent drugs. Framing accidental poisonings as a symptom of abstract despair, while it romantically obscures the immediate medical and chemical realities of how the modern drug market actually operates.
Let's lay out the foundation of our positions then. The core of my argument rests on a pretty simple mechanism. Human beings turn to chemical substances when their environment is devoid of connection, stability, and meaning.
The environment as the primary driver.
Exactly. We see this mirrored perfectly in Bruce K. Alexander's 1978 rat park experiment, which we will definitely unpack. But when we scale that concept up to human society, the numbers are just staggering.
You're referring to the Case and Deaton data.
Yeah. Economists Anne Case and Angus Deaton documented a phenomenon they called deaths of despair. They found that the mortality rate for 45 to 54-year-old white Americans without a college degree stopped declining in 1999.
Which was a massive reversal of historical trends.
A totally unprecedented reversal, right? To put the math in perspective, if mortality had simply continued to decline at its historical rate of 2% a year, we would have avoided an estimated 600,000 excess deaths by 2017.
Wow, 600,000.
600,000 people. And these deaths are driven by three specific things: suicides, alcoholic liver disease, and drug overdoses. I attribute this directly to the systematic dismantling of the American working class.
The loss of the manufacturing base, things like that.
Right. We've seen the loss of stable manufacturing jobs, the erosion of community institutions, and the rise of this hyper-expensive healthcare system that aggressively drains working class wages. We have effectively built a societal cage of despair, and people are predictably trying to numb themselves to the sheer pain of living inside it.
I come at it from a different way. While the environment undeniably matters, equating all substance-related deaths to a broad concept like despair, it completely glosses over the biological mechanics of addiction.
But the environment triggers those mechanics.
Sure. But we have to look at the clinical and genetic realities first. Michelle M. Marr's work in rehabilitation counseling highlights a stark biological fact. 40 to 60% of the population variability in developing an addiction is strictly attributable to genetic factors.
40 to 60%?
Yes. And beyond the biology, relying on Christopher J. Room's critique of the case in Deaton narrative, I argue that this mortality spike is not some generalized wave of working-class sadness. It is a highly specific, supply-driven crisis.
You are referring to the pharmaceutical market, right?
Exactly. This epidemic was ignited by the aggressive marketing and overprescription of opioids like OxyContin in the late 1990s. When that supply was finally regulated, the illicit market didn't just disappear.
It pivoted.
It transitioned to heroin and eventually to highly lethal synthetic fentanyl. People are not dying simply because they are sadder or more despairing than previous generations. They are dying because the drugs available today are exponentially more lethal.
Well, if we're going to argue about whether society is the cage or biology is the trap, we really need to look at how addiction starts in the brain. The biopsychosocial model acknowledges biology, psychology, and society, but the mechanics suggest the model leans heavily toward the social.
Okay, let's hear the mechanics.
Let's break down Bruce K. Alexander's first rat park experiment. He took 32 albino rats.
Right, and it's important to note that usually rats in these addiction studies are kept in standard laboratory cages.
Exactly. Tiny, solitary metal boxes. Solitary confinement, essentially. Alexandra placed some rats in those cramped cages, but he placed others in Rat Park, a 95-square-foot open-topped enclosure.
A rat paradise.
Yeah, he gave them wheels, toys, and space to play, fight, and mate. Both groups had access to tap water and a sweet solution containing 0.5 milligrams of morphine. And he forced them to consume the morphine for 57 days, just to ensure they experienced the drug and developed a baseline tolerance.
So they were physically dependent.
They were. But when the forest period ended and they were finally given a choice between the morphine and regular tap water, the results were astounding. The rats in Rat Park overwhelmingly rejected the morphine solution.
And the isolated rats?
The isolated males consumed 16 times more morphine than the socialized males. 16 times. We have to ask why. It's because of dopamine. When a mammal is isolated, their baseline dopamine plummets. They are neurochemically starved.
And the morphine replaces that.
Exactly. The morphine mimics endorphins and spikes dopamine, effectively replacing the neurochemicals that socialization naturally provides. The drug didn't inherently hijack the brains of the socialized rats because their environment was already providing the neurochemical rewards they needed. The isolation is what drove the consumption.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered the severe limitations of mapping rodent behavior in a plywood box directly onto the complexities of human addiction?
I mean, the biological pathways are incredibly similar.
Similar? Sure. But if you're listening to this, you're probably thinking, wait, my uncle had a great job, a loving family, a rich social life, and he still drank himself to death. And that is exactly where biological vulnerability comes in. First, we have to acknowledge gene-environment correlation.
Meaning what exactly in this context?
Meaning that genetic factors actually influence the type of environment an individual might expose themselves to, or how their brain processes stress within that environment.
Okay, but
Let me just finish this thought. When we talk about that 40 to 60% heritability factor from Mars research, we aren't talking about a single addiction gene. We are talking about inherited variations in dopamine receptor density, or differences in how the liver metabolizes enzymes, or deficits in the prefrontal cortex's impulse control.
right, it's a constellation of factors.
Exactly. Furthermore, even if we stay strictly within the confines of Rat Park, the data isn't as utopian as the narrative suggests. The enriched environment didn't provide absolute immunity. During those choice days in the experiment, the socialized females still consumed an average of 1.00 milligram of morphine per kilogram of body weight. So biology was actively shaping this behavior regardless of how nice the cage was.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. If 40 to 60% of addiction is genetic, that biology is simply a loaded gun.
And the environment is the trigger?
The environment is the finger pulling the trigger. Even with a genetic predisposition, even with fewer dopamine receptors, a rich, connected environment acts as a safety mechanism. It prevents the switch of addiction from flipping.
But they still consumed the morphine.
Sure, those social rats who consumed a small amount of morphine didn't overdose and die. They naturally regulated their intake because they had other sources of meaning and stimulation. The isolated rats had absolutely nothing else. And I think this perfectly transitions us from the animal model to the macro societal level.
How so?
Because when we look at modern American economic structures through the lens of Case and Beaton's findings, we are essentially looking at a massive population-level isolation cage built entirely around people without a bachelor's degree.
How exactly are you defining the mechanics of this societal cage?
I'm defining it through the targeted economic and social decay of the working class. Case and Beaton point out that the mortality crisis heavily targets those without a 4-year degree. Why? Because they are the demographic bearing the absolute brunt of the loss of union power and the rise of corporate rent-seeking.
Light. The structural changes in the economy.
And we need to be clear about how this actually feels to a worker. This isn't just abstract economics. Take our healthcare system. It eats up roughly 18% of our GDP. Instead of protecting people, it functions as a compounding tax on living.
It's incredibly expensive, yes.
Imagine a worker whose real wages have stagnated for 30 years, but their health insurance premiums and deductibles have quadrupled. Their disposable income shrinks to zero. Every minor emergency becomes a catastrophic debt.
It generates chronic stress.
Exactly. It creates chronic cortisol spikes. And that economic stagnation destroys community pillars. When the factory leaves town, the local diner closes, bowling leagues fold, marriage rates inevitably decline because financial stress destroys relationships.
The social fabric unravels.
Completely unravels. The protective social enclosure of the working class has been dismantled over decades, leaving millions of people in the equivalent of solitary confinement. The pain of that isolation becomes unbearable, so they seek out the morphine water.
Your narrative relies heavily on the idea that this economic decline directly sparked this specific wave of death. But Christopher Room points out a crucial timeline discrepancy that, frankly, shatters this causality.
Shatters it? I wouldn't go that far.
Well, hear me out. The economic and social decline of the American working class that you just described beautifully, the stagnant wages, the declining marriage rates, the collapse of union power, all of that began in the 1970s.
Right, with the deindustrialization of the Rust Belt.
Precisely. Yet the mortality rates for this demographic didn't actually spike until the late 1990s. In fact, Rum's analysis explicitly notes that for 45 to 54-year-old whites, mortality rates fell slightly or remained completely flat through the mid-1990s.
But the vulnerability was building.
So I have to ask, if despair from economic stagnation is the primary engine of this crisis, why is there a 25-year delay on the dying? People were losing their jobs and their unions in 1982. Why didn't the overdose rates explode then?
Well, I have to admit, when I first read Christopher Rum's critique of the deaths of despair timeline, I was stumped. The 25-year delay didn't make intuitive sense to me until I started looking at how vulnerabilities compound over time.
So how do you explain the gap?
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. The timeline delay doesn't disprove the despair. It proves the despair was the dry tinder waiting for a spark. You can have a forest suffering from decades of drought. That's the economic stagnation stretching from the 1970s to the 90s, but the forest doesn't burn down until lightning strikes.
And the lightning is OxyContin.
The aggressive marketing of OxyContin, which launched in 1996, was the lightning. But the vulnerability, the reason the fire spread so rapidly and devastated that specific working class demographic rather than everyone equally, was entirely environmental.
But you are fundamentally mischaracterizing the nature of the fire itself. You're grouping all these deaths under the romantic umbrella of despair, which implies a deep, intentional giving up on life. It sounds like a suicide.
Not all despair is conscious suicide.
But Room's data shows that non-intentional drug fatalities account for a staggering 78% of the mortality increase for men aged 25 to 54.
Meaning they didn't mean to die.
Exactly. These are not intentional suicides of despair. These are accidental poisonings by an increasingly toxic drug supply. We need to explain how this actually happens biologically.
Sure, the pharmacology is brutal.
When someone buys a pill on the street today, believing it's a standard pharmaceutical oxycodone, it is almost certainly pressed with fentanyl. Fentanyl is lipophilic, meaning it dissolves easily in fat. Because the human brain is largely fat, fentanyl crosses the blood-brain barrier almost instantaneously.
It hits incredibly fast.
Fast and hard. It latches onto the mu-opioid receptors in the brainstem, which control autonomous breathing. It doesn't just get the user high. It flips the precise neurological switch that tells the lungs to expand and contract.
Right, it stops respiratory function.
A person who takes that pill and stops breathing 3 minutes later did not die of despair. They died of acute chemical poisoning. The market introduced an unprecedentedly lethal agent. It is a supply-side shock, plain and simple.
But we cannot ignore the demand side. Why were they seeking out the illicit pill in the first place? To resolve this tension between the dry tinder of the environment and the lightning strike of the drug supply, we only have to look at a recent simultaneous shock to both systems: the COVID-19 pandemic.
Oh, the pandemic data is fascinating here. It really is. This was a moment where the physical isolation of the cage became completely literal for everyone. During the pandemic, the CDC reported that 13% of Americans started or increased substance use specifically to cope with stress. Which is a huge spike in behavioral use. Furthermore, the Overdose Detection Mapping Application Program, ODMAP, which tracks real-time suspected overdoses nationwide, reported an 18% spike in opiate overdoses. And who bore the brunt of this? Marginalized groups. Right.
African Americans and Hispanics experienced disproportionately higher rates of new substance abuse. This was directly tied to the sudden loss of social support, overwhelming economic burdens, and forced physical isolation. It was a modern human rat park experiment, and when we forced people into isolation, the overdose rates skyrocketed.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. You are attributing the pandemic mortality spike entirely to the psychological pain of isolation, but you are completely ignoring the mechanical collapse of the medical and regulatory systems that keep people with the biological disease of addiction alive.
You mean the treatment centers closing?
I mean the entire infrastructure of survival. The pandemic deaths weren't just about people being sad and lonely in lockdown. Clinics shut down, in-person detoxification centers became completely inaccessible due to quarantine measures, and crucially, regulations around X waivers initially bottlenecked access to life-saving medication.
Wait, before we move past that, for listeners who aren't steeped in medical regulations, what exactly is an X waiver and why does it matter?
Sure, it was essentially a special, highly restrictive DEA hurdle that doctors had to jump through just to prescribe buprenorphine.
The treatment drug.
Right. And buprenorphine is a partial opioid agonist. Structurally, it fits perfectly into the brain's opioid receptors, which satisfies the biological hunger and prevents excruciating physical withdrawal, but it doesn't activate the receptor fully enough to cause a euphoric high or suppress breathing.
It stabilizes them.
It is a miracle medication for opioid use disorder, but during the pandemic, access to it was bottlenecked. The deaths spiked because the medical treatment for a physiological disease was suddenly severed, and at the exact same time, the illicit supply chain was disrupted.
The cartels pivoted again.
Cartels shifted even more heavily to fentanyl because it is vastly easier to synthesize in a lab and smuggle across borders than cultivating fields of poppies for heroin. When you abruptly cut off medical support and simultaneously make the street supply 10 times more toxic, people die. It is a biological and regulatory failure, not just an emotional one.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning, because you are treating the crisis as if it exists in a clinical vacuum. If the solution is purely medical, if it's just a matter of expanding telehealth, dispensing methadone more freely, and removing those X waivers, how do you explain the trajectory of the epidemic over the last decade?
The trajectory tracks with the supply.
But even when prescription opioids were tightly regulated post-2011, when they rolled out the crush-resistant formulation of OxyContin, overdoses didn't stop. They rose exponentially. Doesn't the constant substitution in the market from prescription pills to heroin and then to fentanyl prove that the underlying demand, that despair, is the actual driver?
No, it proves the addiction is driving them.
If you don't fix the cage, the demand remains, and the market will simply find a new, more efficient, and often more lethal supply to meet that unyielding demand.
The substitution to heroin and fentanyl doesn't prove that despair is the primary driver. It proves that physiological addiction is incredibly powerful. Once a brain's neurochemistry has been fundamentally altered by opioid dependence, which again was heavily influenced by that 40 to 60% genetic vulnerability,
That person is trapped in a biological imperative to avoid severe withdrawal.
But they had to take the drug first to get dependent.
Opioid withdrawal is a physiological nightmare. It feels like dying. When the medical establishment abruptly cut off the supply of prescription opioids without providing adequate, wide-scale, medically assisted treatment, those physiologically dependent individuals were violently forced into the illicit market.
And that market was waiting for them.
And the illicit market had shifted to fentanyl, not because the users demanded fentanyl, most users actively feared it, but because fentanyl is cheaper to produce and easier to transport. The users didn't want a more lethal drug, they were exposed to it by brutal cartel economics.
But that still begs the ultimate question. Who was vulnerable to that initial exposure in the first place? The Case and Deaton data clearly shows that college-educated individuals largely escaped this mortality crisis.
They have better access to care.
If this were purely a biological vulnerability meeting a ruthless, equal opportunity drug market, the death toll should cut across class lines relatively evenly. Genetic predispositions to addiction don't magically skip people who hold bachelor's degrees.
Well, no, of course not.
The reason the working class was devastated is precisely because they lacked the economic and social buffers that protect the educated class. Their environment was already fractured. When the lightning struck, their house was the one made of dry wood.
Look, I won't deny that a higher income and premium health insurance provide an undeniable safety net when someone develops a substance use disorder. Better access to high-quality rehabilitation, private therapy, and medically assisted treatment absolutely saves lives.
It's a huge buffer.
But as policymakers and scientists, we must be precise with our language and our causal mechanisms. Calling this a death of despair is actually quite dangerous. It suggests that the primary intervention should be fixing capitalism or rebuilding the manufacturing sector.
Which we should do anyway.
Those are massive, multi-generational socioeconomic projects. Meanwhile, people are dying today, this afternoon, because a microgram of fentanyl paralyzed their respiratory system. If we focus too much on dismantling the societal cages, we risk ignoring the urgent, immediate need for harm reduction, naloxone distribution, and the expansion of biological interventions that can keep a person breathing tomorrow.
I think it's time we summarize where we stand. From my perspective, whether we are looking at the 32 rats isolated in laboratory cages, or the hollowed-out working-class communities documented by Case and Deaton, or the socially distanced populations suffering during the COVID-19 pandemic, the epidemiological data demands we look at the macro picture.
The big picture, sure.
The crisis of addiction and mortality is a profound failure of our social and economic environments to provide meaning, connection, and stability. While the specific chemical agent of death may change over the decades, from alcohol to OxyContin to fentanyl, the vulnerability that drives people toward those substances is rooted in the systematic dismantling of their social enclosures. It is a terrifying reality, but we simply cannot medicate our way out of a societal collapse.
And to summarize my stance, while social connection and economic stability are undeniably vital to human flourishing, framing accidental overdoses from highly potent neurochemical agents as despair is intellectually imprecise. It obscures the mechanics of the immediate crisis.
Mechanics matter. I agree.
This is a supply-driven epidemic that ruthlessly exploited human biological vulnerability, a vulnerability that is 40 to 60% heritable. The 25-year delay in the mortality timeline, as Christopher Rumm highlighted, proves that economic stagnation alone did not cause this. The introduction of highly lethal fat-soluble opioids did. Our public health policy must prioritize urgent, precise medical interventions, supply-side regulation, and immediate harm reduction, rather than waiting for society to solve the abstract, sprawling concepts of capitalist despair.
I think it's clear we both acknowledge that the biopsychosocial model requires addressing both ends of the spectrum. We must deal with the immediate supply of lethal drugs, and we must also address the systemic environmental inequalities that make certain communities so terribly vulnerable in the first place.
Agreed. Our continued point of contention really lies in where public health policy should prioritize its finite energy and resources. Do we manage the immediate medical and chemical realities of the drug market, or do we attempt the monumental, perhaps impossible task of restructuring the socioeconomic environment?
It seems understanding this crisis requires us to hold both the macroeconomic and microbiological perspectives simultaneously. There's clearly much more to explore within the epidemiological data to truly understand the delicate balance of human resilience and biological vulnerability.
Absolutely.
We started this discussion by looking at a collapsed bridge, wondering if it was the decades of structural rust or the sudden crushing weight of the truck that finally brought it down. Perhaps the most uncomfortable truth is that without the rust, the truck passes safely, but without the truck, the rusted bridge still stands. The question we leave you with is, which one do we fix first before the next truck arrives?